Annual address to Parliament 10 years ago this month, Russian President Vladimir Putin called the demise of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. He went on to say, quote, "Tens of millions of our fellow citizens and countrymen found themselves beyond the fringes of Russian territory." Fast forward to 2014. As tensions mount with the West, Russia reunites with Crimea, citing the will of the people. In a documentary released this month, Putin says he was merely righting a historical wrong. Again quoting, "It's because this has elements of historical justice. I believe we did the right thing and I don't regret anything." For Putin, while Ukraine is more complicated, the same doctrine applies. Observers say he's not looking to annex the country, but wants to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO and, by extension, avoid a Western military presence on his doorstep. As proof of his peaceful intentions, Putin supporters argue that it was the Russian president who helped broker the current ceasefire, preventing a military confrontation with the West. And in Syria, when US President Barack Obama threatened military action against the Assad government's alleged use of poison gas, it was Putin who helped defuse the situation, convincing the Syrian president to give up his chemical weapons. Russia has also joined the fight against Islamic State, arming Syria in its battle against the extremists. So is Vladimir Putin a shameless expansionist or a peacekeeper? Joining us from Toronto to talk about it is the internationally syndicated and online columnist Eric Margolis. He was the first Western journalist given access to KGB headquarters in Moscow 26 years ago. And with us from Moscow is Vyacheslav Nikonov, a veteran politician and former staff member to Russian Presidents Gorbachev, Yeltsin and Putin. He's currently a member of Russia's parliament, the Duma. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Vyacheslav, let's start with you. You've written that there is a strategy to Putin's actions. It might not be clear, but there is a strategy. Define that strategy for us.
Well, he is definitely a man of vision, who wants to see Russia a strong and prosperous country. When he became almost accidentally, the acting president and then president of Russia 15 years ago, Russia was in a very weak status. It was the 14th largest economy with GDP close to 300 billion US dollars. And now it's the 5th largest economy with GDP around $3.5 trillion and with an army capable of defending itself. So Putin's strategy is to bring Russia back as one of great powers, living in peace with itself and the rest of the world.
Eric, you've credited Putin with staving off what could have been a serious political crisis in the Middle East when he stepped in to persuade Bashar al-Assad of Syria to give up chemical weapons. That's after the United States was not able to do that. He stepped in and basically diffused a potentially serious situation there. What did Putin gain by convincing Assad to give up these weapons?
Well, he prevented what appeared to be an imminent American air campaign against Syria, a widening of the Syrian war with unpredictable consequences, which is very close to Russia. So he had a very positive effect, and particularly in a crisis which was somewhat phony, because it turned out that the Syrians really didn't have the poison gas that they were claiming to be using against the rebels. It was a spurious problem, but the U.S. giving the U.S. an exit from this crisis into which the U.S. had pushed a little too hard caused great sighs of relief in Europe.
Vyacheslav, you just talked about the Putin strategy, how he's built Russia up from the 14th biggest economy to now become the 5th largest economy in the world. Also, that it has a military that wants to live in peace with its neighbors. But let's talk about Ukraine. It's seen in very different ways from the West and from Russia. The Western perspective is that this was an invasion of a sovereign country, that Putin was interfering in the internal affairs of another country. The Russian view was that Ukraine was part of its orbit and that it was becoming a threat to Russia. Will Ukraine in the future be allowed to chart its own course and, if the day comes, join NATO as well?
Well, the problem with Ukraine is that it is not a sovereign country anymore. It's run from Washington, D.C. after the so-called Revolution of Dignity, which was just another American regime change operation. They've got the revolution, and the regime had revolutionary legitimacy. At this time, some parts of the country just rejected the government, which they considered to be ultranationalist. And of course, some parts of the country populated by Russians decided that it's time for them to secede from that regime. And luckily for them, in the Crimea, there were legally Russian forces which helped to arrange the referendum, in which 97% of the public supported the idea of joining Russia. Unfortunately, there were and still there are no Russian troops in eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk and Lugansk, and that's why they've got the civil war. The Ukrainian government preferred to attack their own citizens with tanks, with artillery, killing thousands and thousands already. And this is a big tragedy for the Ukrainian people. Of course, we regard Ukraine as a friendly nation. Unfortunately, the regime they've got now do not reflect the interests of the Ukrainian people. And of course, if Russian forces there were there, I can tell you that there is not a single military task which the Russian army cannot fulfill in matter of hours in Ukraine. There is no strategy of defeating Ukraine militarily.
Eric, what is your view on what happened in Ukraine? I mean, the Russians say that the United States and its allies were the aggressors, and they see the eastward expansion of NATO and the possible incorporation of Ukraine into NATO as being one of the primary causes of tensions in that region. The United States and its allies, for their part, say this was an outright invasion. It was annexation, which we should not accept in this day and age.
Well, I think we have to take a middle view between these two positions. I've been to Crimea a number of times. It always struck me as being largely Russian. Historically, it was over 200, 250 years, 300 years. It's been Russian, but most important, as I've written, Sevastopol, the great port of Crimea, was one of Russia's most important naval bases, if not the most important, in giving Russia access to the Black Sea and to the Mediterranean and onward into the other oceans of the world. It was as important as Houston is as a port to the United States. And speaking just from pure military terms, there was no way that Russia could tolerate Ukraine joining NATO and having NATO with a presence or stranglehold on the important port of Sevastopol. It just could not happen. And everybody knew it or should have known it. In fact, I wrote a year and a half ago that this was crazy and that Russia would be forced to act. Crimea was given to Ukraine by Nikita Khrushchev. I think it was in 1954, in the midst of a drunken dinner celebrating some anniversary. He said, "Here, you take Crimea." It's like the U.S. giving Texas to the Mexicans. It just was an unnatural event, and it should not have happened. And I don't call what Russia's annexing Crimea, I call it reunification, like the reunification of Germany. Nevertheless, it's very important for Russia to show that it does not have other designs on other regions of Ukraine or other European countries.
And Vyacheslav, does Russia have designs on other parts of Ukraine? Because about 10 years ago, when President Putin addressed the Duma, he said, and these are his words, he said the breakup of the Soviet Union was, quote, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. Are we seeing President Putin now take steps to restore what was the Soviet Union, to reverse that catastrophe?
Well, actually, the collapse of your own country is a catastrophe. For the rest of the world, it doesn't look that way. I considered myself to be a Soviet citizen, not as citizens of Russia, and so many people regarded it and still regard it as a big catastrophe when such big country fall apart. As for the ambitions of the Russian Federation, until the coup in Kiev, there were no talks about that, of course. Ukraine into NATO is not an option for Russia, but it's not an option for NATO as well. There are no such plans today to bring Ukraine into NATO. There were such plans before the coup and before this crisis on Ukraine. The problem is that now this crisis is used by the United States, which is probably 90% of NATO de facto, is to bring more and more American forces closer to the borders of Russia, to the Baltic states, to Ukraine now, and to Poland, to Czech Republic, to Hungary, to Romania, to Bulgaria. These things, of course, are not regarded as being friendly towards Russia. Some Americans say that Russia is so arrogant that it approached the American military and naval bases which are around Russia. And I can tell you, there are 400 such bases around Russian territory. So can Putin be, not aware of that or be happy about that? As for the talks about Russians' desires against the Baltic states, it's not an issue here. It is an issue in the Western media as part of the campaign to bring more American troops as close to the Russian border as possible.
Eric, I want to get back to something I asked Vyacheslav earlier on. When we look at a grand plan here by President Putin or a strategy, when you look at what he's done over the past few years, do you detect a Putin doctrine here? And what is that doctrine?
I think the doctrine is a traditional Russian geopolitics in trying to increase Russia's strength, but without provoking any wars, any major incidents. Yes, I think he probably is trying to reassemble some of the former Soviet Union, and why not? That's in Russia's national interest, which he's pursuing. But the fact that portraying President Putin as a dangerous warmonger, as is done in the West, is absolutely wrong, because aside from retaking the Crimea, his policies have been relatively restrained. I mean, these events in Ukraine are happening right next door to Russia, and I think if such similar events were happening in Mexico, for example, the United States would be more forthright in taking military activity. Mr. Putin has been very conservative. He's been very careful in what he's doing. He realizes that he's holding a weaker hand of cards, but there is a growing conviction, certainly in Russia, that the West, led by the United States, is trying to undermine the Russian Federation and tear it down. And for example, just yesterday, President Putin accused the U.S. of supporting the Chechen rebels in the 1990s. So it's caution is the word, but slow and steady progress without getting Russia into a major war.
Vyacheslav, has President Putin taken certain actions, perhaps mistakes, that actually rightfully give the West reason for concern over his intentions?
Well, Putin was asked this question many times about his mistakes, and he said that he never made a single mistake. And I do not see real serious mistakes done by Putin. He is reacting very rationally at the challenges facing Russian security. And we also know that, the West is happy with Russia only when it is falling apart. Russia had good media in the West only twice during last millennium. And that was some months in 1917 and 1991 when Russia was literally disintegrating. All other periods of Russian history, disregarding the policies of Moscow, these policies are considered to be aggressive, imperialist, and so on and so forth. So it's about a long-term confrontation with Russia, which was conducted by the West for many centuries. We remember Napoleon, we remember Hitler. You know, Americans are acting according to that logic. This is the logic of hegemony. And Russia is, of course, the only country on earth which can present existential threat to the United States. And so weakening Russia is an American strategy, and we know that. And of course, you know, Putin is here to please the Russian people, to reflect the interests of the Russian state, and not to please the Western media or Western governments.